Here is scripture from Luke chapter 22. He came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling on the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into this time of trial."
Grace and peace to all of you. It's wonderful to be with you today. I appreciate my friend Keith inviting me to be here with you. And Michael, had I known how well you were going to turn out after graduating from Central, I'd go back and raise your grades. You know what? Probably no need to do so, however. He's made a terrible decision. He's decided to go to Phillips rather than to come to United of the Twin Cities. And so for that, I'm not sure there's absolution, but we will talk. It's great to have a number of my family members here today. Even a couple of them waved some palms as they went up and down the aisle. So great to have all of you. I would have hosted you for lunch even without coming to church, but thank you for being here today. Particularly my brother and sister-in-law are here from Tulsa. I guess you have to travel to hear good preaching. They're with the Methodists, so there you go. This Sunday was always known simply as Palm Sunday, until 1970. And in 1970, some of the higher ups, I suppose, maybe in Rome, said, let's broaden it, because the lectionary texts for today are very long, and you should be very thankful. I'm not going to preach them all, or you would have had to pack a lunch, I'm sure, because chapter after chapter in Luke are a part of the appointed readings for today. The singular focus on the palms and the festivity of the triumphal entry overshadows what quickly becomes stark and grim and a darker understanding of the passion of Jesus. It's the final momentous week, which faith and history has named holy. And so the church at large began to think of this not simply as Palm, but Palm Passion Sunday, and we will consider both this morning. But first, the entry. It was spectacular. It was an unabashed political act, and it was a prophetic provocation. We like to focus on children, lowly donkey, clothes spread, but Jesus was up to a provocation. It deliberately countered what was happening on the other side of the city. Jesus entering from the east, from the Mount of Olives, and the imperial forces of Rome coming through the west. Jesus modeled his identity much after the prophets and disappointed person after person, particularly his close followers, by the kind of Messiah he would be. Taking a page from Zechariah, Jesus shows this kind of leadership. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he will command peace to the nations. The opposite side of the city, the west, the troops escorting Pontius Pilate, we'll hear more about him later in the week, were also entering the city. There were prancing steeds, the white horses of the conqueror. There was the squeak of leather armor as the soldiers marched. There was weaponry of the occupying army, ironically showing up to keep the peace during the Passover season. As Passover drew near and the great gathering of Jews in the city, the Romans thought they had better keep close eye. Two New Testament scholars contrast the two parades. One was a peasant procession, and one was an imperial procession. Now, on display was not only the might of Rome with the golden eagles atop the banners and all showing the might of Rome, but also imperial theology. You see, it had worked its way into the Roman consciousness that the Caesar was divine. The Caesar was to be called the Son of God. It goes back to Augustus, before the time of Jesus, but this is brewing, and so the conflict between Rome and the messianic hope of Israel could not be in starker contrast. Jesus came to be seen as a rival to the imperial theology. You remember what his preferred designation of himself was? Son of humanity. Now the crowd is calling him Son of David, Hosanna, which means save us right now. But probably the underbelly of that statement was, save us from the heel of Rome, throw them off, and be a real Messiah, and establish the Davidic kingdom once again. And he disappointed in that. You remember the mama of James and John, I don't know if they put her up to it, went to Jesus and said, when you come into your kingdom, can my boys sit at the right and left? To which Jesus said, probably not going to happen the way you think. You can imagine how torn the observers of these two parades would be. You see, Jerusalem isn't that big. They weren't that far apart, coming through the opposite sides. Perhaps persons viewed both of the processions. Can you imagine what went through their minds? Is there not stability in the protection of Rome? Is Jesus of Nazareth just one more messianic pretender? We've seen a whole bunch of those along the way. And one can wonder if some of the same voices who cried Hosanna later join the mob crying, crucify him, preferring the release of Barabbas to the release of Jesus. Now, their generation was not the only one so fickle as political winds shifted. We live in such a time of competing beliefs. The week that unfolds is blessed by final teachings in the temple, tender expressions of community, foot washing, the establishment of Eucharist, but it's also a bitter week of betrayal, abandonment, and public humiliation, that we still acknowledge these events millennia later demonstrates the impact of this singular life. Now, if I were to ask you to define passion, we might come up with several different words. At its root, in Latin, it means suffering, but it also means one's greatest life pursuit. What is the great passion that drives your life? What was it for Jesus? I believe his great passion was to create a different vision of God, both for those who felt smug in their privilege and for those who felt far off, estranged by their sin. And you remember over and over his message was mercy. Neither do I condemn. Leave her alone. She has done a beautiful thing, daughter of Abraham. Stand up. Over and over, acknowledging a greater expanse, a wideness in God's mercy. Now, Jesus had a hearing all across Israel, remarkably. Not just the Anawim, the poor, faithful remnant of the land, people like Mary and Joseph, Elizabeth, Zechariah, people who still believed that a Messiah would come. But he also had a hearing among some of the Jewish leaders, as well as some of the Greeks, and yes, even a few among the Roman occupancy. Now, the fact that Jesus amassed significant crowds, and there were always these gatherings across the Galilee, later in the temple, alerted Rome. Have you ever wondered why so many centurions show up in the story? They're shadowing Jesus. They want to make sure this doesn't get out of hand. And you can imagine the alarm when this procession occurs. I don't know if you watched all of Cory Booker. I could not. I cannot imagine preaching for 25 hours. I would be in a puddle. He bested Strom Thurmond, of course, which is quite the feat. I met Strom Thurmond once. That was enough. Anyway, Booker called the United States to its higher pursuits. He showed a passion almost unmatched right now about what he believes is going on. Troubled by threats, he was unwavering in his love for our country, and he demonstrated the kind of passion worthy of one's life. And I think it's a worthwhile question for each of us. What is it that captures our heart, our best energies? To what will we give ourselves? What is the great passion that claims us? For me, it's always been the privilege of teaching students pathways to love God and to love others, hence to love themselves, so that they might do the former better. Our call to worship was a lamenting psalm. The one who feels cut off and assurance of God's presence has ebbed. It's linked to these passion narratives because of the experience the psalmist is narrating is quite similar to what Jesus experiences in the garden. The psalmist longs for God's face to shine upon him once again. Some of us pray that prayer in these perilous times. But let's move to the garden. The scene in the garden is also a scene of passion, presaging the passion of the cross. It reveals the real human struggle that Jesus faced as he contemplated what lay ahead. Let me read just a brief excerpt from Bishop Buddy. You know of her. She had a nice speech to the president at the National Cathedral. She's written a wonderful little book, How to Learn to Be Brave. And here's what she writes of Jesus' night in the garden. For all the clarity he once felt about his vocation and the initial acceptance of his fate, on that last night Jesus prays to God that he might be spared. This poignant scene assures us that he too knew fear and the deep desire to live. We aren't told how long Jesus struggled between his appeal to God and coming to a renewed acceptance of what lay ahead. We only know that at some point during the long, lonely night, Jesus embraced his fate and made it an offering, a self-giving of sacrificial love. You cannot read this text without this deep sense of abandonment. His closest friends could not stay awake, could not watch with him. Were they worn out? Were they terrified? We don't know. Luke gives us this image. It's almost an aside. And an angel came and strengthened him, but really nothing. Returning to the disciples, asking them, could you not watch? Jürgen Moltmann, the German theologian, has written of this text and said, at last, ultimately, the only support Jesus had was the ground, only the ground. He had faith, and yet there was much unknown for him. Can you imagine the questions that ran through his mind during the long night? Has my life's mission been a fool's errand? Who am I to think I could reverse centuries of thinking about what a Messiah is like? Even my followers seem to find Rome more appealing, or at least an establishment of a new imperial rule that they would staff. Jesus moves forward in faith, but without assured outcomes. The tradition in which I grew up has Jesus knowing it all before it happens, having some sort of perfect vision to foretell the future. But you realize the gospel narratives are written long after resurrection, and they kind of accord an omniscience to Jesus that may not bear out as we contemplate these texts. Does he believe in resurrection? Yes. As a faithful Jew at the last day. Does he believe he will be raised in 3 days? I'm not so sure. I think he walks in faith. I think he entrusts his fate to God, whom he continues to trust. So what are we to make of this segment of Jesus' story? We celebrate. It was fleeting. We ponder. We also walk in faith. We walk alongside spiritual kin who are celebrating different holidays as of last night. Jesus walks in faith, continuing to trust. So my invitation to you this morning, don't rush through the week. Pause, think about the different events and in quiet contemplation we might find new meaning in his life of passion, even as we interrogate, what claims my life, and is it worth it? Following Jesus is an expression of trust in God's goodness. And so let's walk forward. Amen.